Basically, what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of some of the basics of LiveOps, some of the stuff I've figured out over the last nearly 7 years that I've been doing it. So some of it might be really basic for you guys, some of it you might not be doing, some of it you might see it for the first time. So hopefully you'll learn something, hopefully you might be able to check what you guys are doing against what we're doing and make some improvements, or even come up to me later on and let me know some improvements I can make. So my name is Andrew Munden. I'm the LiveOps director for Space Ape Games. If you haven't heard of us, we're a pretty small studio based in London. We were recently acquired by Supercell, so that's nice. So I always like to start with this. I want to give myself a little bit of street cred before you go, why should I listen to this guy? So back in 2011, I started doing LiveOps at a small publishing company called GPotato. I worked on 3 games directly, and I worked on a bunch of other games with some of my colleagues. After that, I went to Area Games, where I worked on Wolf Team, and one of the things we do at Space Ape is every new employee has to give an embarrassing fact. Scarlet Blade is my embarrassing fact. If you Google it, you'll know why. And then I went to Kabam, and I worked on Dragons of Atlantis for 2.5 years. So after that, I joined Space Ape in 2015, and this is all for LiveOps, all of it. So I've done a bit of everything everywhere. I did setting up events, I did localization, I did community management, tickets, everything, everywhere. So I started off on Rival Kingdoms, and I set up their live operations there. We learned a lot about how got Space Ape used to doing LiveOps. They weren't really doing it that well. And then we went to Transformers, and that worked a lot better because I started off on Transformers about a month before it launched. So we kind of launched with a whole LiveOps Cadence setup. All of our content was earmarked for specific releases, and the whole thing was planned. So just to jump into it, so what is LiveOps? There's not really a definition. I kind of made one up. So I would say it's do what needs to be done for live games to succeed. And this can mean a lot of different things for different places. When I was at Kabam, we were all about EBITDA and revenue and profit and looking like we wanted to get bought and things like that. Space Ape's really different. We're all about the health of the game and long-term retention and LTV. So to be a bit more detailed, I'm not going to read it out, obviously, because it's a slide, but my point of view from LiveOps is about controlling your content. And if you do LiveOps really well, then it should benefit you and the players. So ideally, you're giving players more events to participate in, more things they'd like to buy, which increases your gross bookings and as well as makes them happier. So some of the really nice things about LiveOps is it's incredibly agile, we're really scrappy and adaptive, so any good LiveOps person can usually take the content that you're giving them and make something up. I mean, when I worked at Area Games, we were publishers, so we couldn't do any code, couldn't do anything, and the amount of nonsense creative LiveOps events we managed to scrap together was insane. A news feed with some items with letters on it and things like that, and we could really influence player behavior and gross bookings. So I'd like to start by talking about what is content, because content is kind of the fuel that fires the LiveOps furnace, though hopefully you're not burning too much of it. So here's Grimlock from Transformers. He's going to tell us what content is. So content is basically anything in the game that you're using to encourage players to participate in events, or you're monetizing directly through IAPs, or you're putting into your gacha. But it can actually be a lot more than that. We have some really cheap content that we like to make for LiveOps stuff. This is an avatar we recently released in Transformers for last weekend's event. We also have boosters, which are basically a JPEG avatar icon with some stats in our CMS. And again, this Peach, while 3D rendered really nice, was an essential material for Rival Kingdoms, which made us a couple $100,000. So for the cost of an artist for 2 hours, we were actually able to make quite a bit of money off of this content. But the content isn't always directly items in-game. So one of the things that we're really proud of are some of the content we create that isn't permanent buffs or permanent items in the game. So for example, in Transformers, we started adding dialogues because a lot of our players are G1 Transformers fans, and they're really just hardcore fans. And what they wanted to see was the characters and the 3D models we made interacting with each other in G1 fashion. So we work with Simon Furman, who's the writer for the G1 cartoon back in the 80s, and he writes us a bunch of these crazy dialogues, and the players really like this. Then we can put this in events, we can trigger it with anything in-game, and it helps its content, and we do increase retention and engagement in our events with this. We also have campaigns. Campaigns are kind of like PvE content. They're kind of expensive for us to make, but they're still content, and they're still cheaper than, say, adding a new 3D asset with a bunch of animations and sound effects and designer time. And the final kind of coup de grace to our content is our events. So we have a really robust LiveOps tool, and we've been developing it over the last 3 years. And it lets us put together these LiveOps events. A lot of the pieces of it are very modular, so we just slide various bits in, and they can be replaced, interchanged, updated, and it's all done live in real time. And so we launched with live events on Transformers, and we have basically had an 80% participation rate in our live events since day one. So everyone who's eligible to participate in an event, 80% of our players do. So our events are our key retention mechanism. So that's really important. So this is an example from Rival Kingdoms. Basically, if you have a live game, you would know that content drives revenue, but it's always nice to see it. So when we launched Rival Kingdoms, we started with the Yagumo event, which we called Force of Nature, and we saw a bump in revenue. We moved on to a Malice event, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, if you've worked in LiveOps long enough, you know that they'll call this the shark fin, and it's not actually that great for your game. So when we moved to Transformers, we wanted to try and avoid our content shark finning like this. So we came up with a plan involving gacha to try and smooth our revenue out. And so by leveraging the IP, we kind of came up with this gacha plan. So Rival Kingdoms, sorry, I have to look at the slide for this one, had rarities, and so does Transformers. So similar to like Contest of Champions, there's the 1-star, 2-star, 3-star type of characters, etc. Rival Kingdoms and duplicate handling is really important when you do gacha. And on Transformers, we actually made it so that we can live ops our duplicate handling. So we can actually update what items you would get in exchange for a bot that you already own when you get it from the gacha. So in Rival Kingdoms, our gacha was really weak because we only had a few ancients. We had about 25 ancients at the time. We have a lot more now, but that's not really a great gacha. Whereas with Transformers, we actually created a lot more versions of the bots. So right now we have about 105 bots, and each one of them has 4 variations. So that's a much more robust gacha. And then we had added a brand. So obviously the brand helps a lot with our gacha. And the key here was we helped to smooth out that shark fin spikiness. Of course, we still have some, but it's much less. So one of the things that we really learned about this content was that not all bots are created equal. When I joined the Transformers team, I had a lot of ideas about how to sell my content, how would I manage my LiveOps pipeline, but a lot of that was from publishing experience and a little bit from Kabam where I could request my own content. But one of the things I had to learn personally was how do I handle branded content? And I was not a big Transformers fan. So when I joined the team, my PO, my product owner, he's biggest Transformers nerd I've ever met, which is awesome because it means that his passion shows in the game. But I would be like, why is this bot more valuable? And they'd have to explain, oh, this is the guy who gets the Matrix of Leadership in the G1 1986 movie, and he holds it. I'm like, all right. So that was the most difficult part of integrating an IP into my LiveOps plan was I had to learn why 106 bots mattered. But it was really important, and it basically is the key fulcrum of our LiveOps strategy on Transformers now. We know that certain bots tug on the heartstrings of our player base. When they see that, they want to be involved with that event. They want to buy that bundle. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about, and the reason I talk about content first is because it's what this is all about. This is what I'm really passionate about, is the execution and design. So for the last nearly 7 years, this is mostly what I've been doing. I've been creating strategies for releasing content, pricing it, putting it into chest, gacha, IAPs, and getting it out there to players. And so I'm always impressed by people who actually get their hands dirty and get their feet on the ground. So this is what I'll be talking about most. So LiveOps design, basically when I joined my first gaming company, no one had any design. It was basically, hey, we got some new content from our overseas developers, let's slap it in the game and put a random price tag on it. And I hated that. So one of the first things I did was I created a framework for pricing things, and I'll talk a bit about that. Then at Area Games, one of my producers actually talked to me about estimated value, and over the last 5 years, I've been improving on that, so I'll discuss that a bit. It's really important for offering consistency to your players, which is kind of my key philosophical point of LiveOps, is to offer consistent experience. And then some design on just how to actually, create these things. So the framework is basically, you want to find the dimensions of value of an item. So I'll run through an example, but if we take a Transformers bot, we can look at how well is this bot known? Was it in the G1 movie? Is he really cool looking? And how strong do we plan to make him? These would all be dimensions of value that we could use to price it. So in my example, we're going to price item T. T for triangle. It's very witty. So we're going to give it a base price of $1. So you always need a starting point. This is usually just a gut feel, something you're just throwing out there. Remember, we're making all of this up, and we'll be adjusting it as the game gets older and the game matures. So I'm going to start with $1, and I'm going to try and identify what makes a triangle valuable. So the first thing I think that makes a triangle valuable is the angles. There's 3 of them, and this one they happen to all be equal. And then the next thing I think that makes a triangle valuable is the length of its sides. And then finally, are all the sides equal? So basically, I think an equilateral triangle is worth more than an isosceles triangle. So those are our dimensions of value, and this is how I would start with any framework. This is a really simple example, but you can price basically anything, no matter how complex, by actually breaking down what will players value. So once we have the dimensions of value, we can figure out some modifiers. I do all of this in Google Sheets. I have these really big Google Sheets that sometimes take way too long to load. I'd love to make it into a tool. Maybe you should look into that. So then the number of angles, I'm going to say, is probably the most important thing. Obviously, if it has 4 angles, it's not a triangle, and it's not worth anything to us. So we're going to say that's an 80% boost. The length of the sides being even is 20%, and being symmetrical is 50. So we could plug that into a formula. We say we start with $1, we multiply it by 100%, obviously, because it starts at $1. Sum all the modifiers, and we're going to come out with a price of $2.50. So the reason this is quite nice is now I can plug in any triangle I want, measure it against my dimensions of value, and I can make a spreadsheet which can price all of these things automatically. So what I would do is fill that out with all my items in the game for every item type, and continually update this so that I know the value of everything. And then if I find that, oh, that's much too expensive, no one wants to pay that, then I can adjust these dimensions, and all of the items will get updated in their value. So this also ties into the next part, which is which is estimated value. So this is an actual Google Sheet example from one of my lovely Google Sheets for designing and pricing. This one is taken from Rival Kingdoms about a year ago. So on the far left, we have some items. The numbers in the 3 middle columns are all weights. So basically, instead of percentages, we always use weights because it's just easier to manage. And on next is quantity, and then some calculations we do. So I'm going to step through this really quick and talk about why it's important. So these are our weights, and we use at Space Ape, we use a system called reward sets, and basically we can create sets of items and assign them weights within that set, and we can also take that set and put it inside of another set. So we can nest all these reward sets, and that allows us to be really flexible and fast without ever just breaking things. It's really hard to leave a weight out in this system once it's made. So this gives us our drop percentage. This would be for a gotcha or a mystery chest or whatever you like to call it. We're just basically taking the weights. So you might notice one of them is not in the reward set 1, so it actually has a different percentage because the weights within reward set 1 determine their percentages. That's a very Space Ape thing. You might not have that. So once we know the drop rate, we can try and figure out what the EV is. So we have the price from our framework in our database, and this is what we came up with, and we're going to import it. Hopefully you can use an import range or something so that you're working off of your master framework, off your item pricing database. Then you would multiply your price times your drop percentage, and this gives you this magical number called EV, or estimated value. So it's a fairly simplistic math, but it's incredibly helpful. So a lot of people ask me like, oh, what does this actually mean? It doesn't mean anything, really. This is a tool for you to offer consistency, for you to design and maintain your LiveOps economy. I can't tell you that if the EV is this will happen, but it's a tool for your LiveOps guys to use. So if you sum all of the EVs of each item and compare that to the actual price of what you're selling it for, so this chest we were saying we were selling it for 299 hard currency. Our EV is 1,353 hard currency. So we have an EV percentage of 453%. So this is a term that you'll usually hear in LiveOps guys throughout if you're working at a bigger company. I know anyone I've worked with will be familiar with this. So if you're working at the Glues, Grees, Kabams, they'll definitely be throwing this number and this kind of terminology around. And this is to help you design things consistently. So if you are working with a team of multiple LiveOps people and someone is designing a chest or a gacha and they come and say, I'm done, it's awesome, it's going to make so much money. And you look at it, it's like, yes, it's got an EV percentage of 1,300. Redesign it. Because it's really easy to break the economy. It's really easy for an inexperienced LiveOps person to make big spikes and make a lot of gross bookings. But actually being consistent and not destroying your game economy is much harder. So all of this is tools to stay consistent and not to break your game economy. So I'll talk a bit about events versus monetization. So we don't look at them as the same thing as Space Ape. At my previous companies, we treated them a little more the same, but I like to actually split them apart. So events and monetization don't necessarily have to be paired together. You can have an event which you don't expect to monetize, but is purely engagement. This would be good for your retention, good for reactivating players, good for just keeping everyone active. Then you can have events which have low participation, but high monetization. So maybe you're targeting that top 5% of your players that are your whales that you really want to get some gross bookings that weekend. You want to engage them. They want something competitive that's just too hardcore for the rest of your player base. Next would be kind of gross bookings. The participation can kind of be anything. You can make a lot of money off of a casual event. You can make a lot of money off an intense event. The event doesn't have anything to do with it in this case. But it does depend on your game design. If you're monetizing more off of core loop aspect, like a Clash of Clans kind of skipping cooldowns training aspect, you will monetize more so off of that. If you're more reliant on your IAPs, for example, like Transformers, we're very much focused on our IAPs. So we can pair a kind of casual event with a very strong IAP, and we can have a good weekend. Engagement can be high participation with low monetization. We do this a lot. We try to not burn our players out. That's one of our big aspirations. I'll talk a bit more about that because we have a whole system in place just to make sure that our players don't get too fatigued. If we start getting a lot of CCS, our customer support emails, or a lot of feedback in chat or just in game that, look guys, we're tired, give us a break, we actually do adjust our LiveOps cadence for that. And fatigue. So that's how events and monetization work together. I'm going to talk a bit about how it all goes together. So this is kind of a overall LiveOps flow for how we do it at Space Ape. So we start off with someone doing some work. And then that work gets tied into a framework. And the framework is, this is a framework I came up with for Transformers. It's kind of a set of rules that we give ourselves. They feel very arbitrary at first. You're just going with your gut. You're going with some information you've got from your team and from some of the players who might have been in your alpha or your beta. But that's your information for building your framework. Then you take your framework and you turn it into an actual pricing database, which you can see all of your items and actually have a dollar value for this. This is very important. You can then use your item database for designing chests and gacha and events. So any event, you should also be having a very clear idea of how much value are you giving out. Because it's very easy to run an event where you give out so much value that you just made everything else in your game feel like crap. So if you're not pricing the content of your events, then you have no idea how your events feel against your core loop. So you might find that all of a sudden everyone's doing your events and your core loop is starting to suffer. So then we can actually take that design and shove it into the game and see how it does. And then there's a really important step of actually validating your results. So these are some of our tools that we use at Space Ape. We use Swerve for some analytics. We use Redshift. Maybe I should talk to the Snowflake guys. We do SQL queries. We use a lot of Tableau dashes, so we can do some ad hoc requests or anything. And we also use Kibana or Logstash, so we can check a lot of our logs in real time. So I can put an event live, and I can actually watch the logs in real time as players begin to engage, earn points, earn prizes, buy bundles. I can see all of that live in real time. And that's super important because if something's broken, it's going to show up real quick. And if you're really LiveOps, you should be able to fix it. So then we would take this information, take a look at it, process it, think about it for a bit. And sometimes we have to go back to the data, but that's fine. You should always be looking at your data, trying to get better. And then comes the ideal situation where you kind of have done this for a while. For example, on Transformers, we've just gone past our 1 year. So we're pretty comfortable with our cadence. We know what events work. We know what events we want to run. We know how we want to mix our content with our events, with the difficulty and everything. So we kind of bypass our framework now. And we still use the item database, but we're really confident now that we don't need to change it. So we don't go back after each event and tweak some of the values and say, oh no, this needs to be 120% from 100%. We're pretty much locked in. And so now we can basically go from work to design to the game to data, validate it, and keep that loop going. So this kind of feeds into the next part of the talk, which is cadence. Cadence is something that we weren't good at, then we got really good at it when we were originally good at it. So Samurai Siege had a really good cadence system, but they didn't have the tools in place to know why it was good. And then when Rival Kingdoms came out, they were trying to do the same thing they did on Samurai Siege, Space Ape's first game, and it wasn't quite working. And so I put in the framework and the pricing and everything, and we could see why. And then we were able to adapt Samurai Siege's cadence system to Rival Kingdoms. So this is Rival Kingdoms' highly technical LiveOps planning board. We had nothing, so we decided to slap some Postit Notes on the wall. And this actually worked amazing. It's one of my favorites. A lot of people, we use Jira, so we're organized all our sprints in Jira. But I don't like Jira for LiveOps because LiveOps is fast. LiveOps happens in real time. You get feedback. You need to react. It has to happen quicker. So if I have a bunch of rigid tickets in Jira that have to be in certain lanes and blah, 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 it's not great for me. So on Rival Kingdoms, we made all these Post-its. We have different weeks, different days, and different colors indicated different things. I think orange was events, and purple was ascension materials, and blue was ancients. And we basically figured out what the content we wanted to release where. And because it was all color-coded and very visual, you could get a real strong feeling for what your next month and a half looked like at the current plan. You could also go up, pull a Post-it note off the wall and realize, hey, there's no blue Post-it notes for 3 weeks, and realize that something was missing from your content. So I really like this. This is also great if there's multiple LiveOps people working on the team. If you're just one person, you don't need it quite as much. You can kind of get away with a spreadsheet, but as soon as multiple people are involved, if you want to move things, it's really, really helpful. So our cadence system works off what we call the finger system. There's 4 fingers. The thumb doesn't count. And we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 finger events, and they're not based on monetization. And this is kind of where our whole differentiation of events and monetization came from. So when we're saying that it's a 1-finger event, we're saying that it's very low fatigue. So that players, if they play this event, we should be able to hit them with something more strenuous the next week or the next couple of days, depending on what your event cadence is. And usually, a 1-finger event has low monetization. This would be more of a engagement event, letting players rest. Then we have a 2-finger event. All of the arrows go up a little bit. And then a 3-finger event where all of the arrows are kind of similar. And then a 4-finger event. And a 4-finger event is going to be incredibly fatiguing. So these are the events which we only run maybe once a month, every 6 weeks kind of thing. So after one of these events, if you ran 2 4-finger events back to back, you would expect that in the second one, your event participation should drop. Your players are going to get really angry and salty. You're going to see an increase in tickets. You're going to see a decrease in IIP purchases, etc. And you'll probably see a spike in churn. So this is kind of really, really key to, I would say, everyone, but we use it a lot. And it's actually become such common terminology at Space Ape that we'll say things like, oh, we're throwing a party, and it's going to be a 4-finger party, so prepare for that. So this is one of our content pipelines. This is something we weren't that great at on Rival Kingdoms or Samurai Siege. We would do this thing, we would release a whole slew of new content, and then we would just move on. We would kind of forget that we ever released it. And because it was LiveOps content, it was built in a way that we could release it, but it wasn't really part of the core loop. So, you get a lot of requests from players, what about this? I really want the nuclear rams. I really want to be able to get Malice. And we were like, it doesn't really fit our LiveOps cadence, so we're not going to do it. And that wasn't great. So one of the things we did on Transformers, I figured out a really basic content pipeline life cycle, and we would basically create a new Transformer. We put them into an event where they would be released through various different mechanics. Then we would put them into an IAP a couple of weeks later. These weeks are not locked in stone, but it's the general principle. Then we would take the crystal from the bundle, we would put it into the shop directly, and after a while, that character would go into the permanent premium character crystal and the free crystal. And the idea is that players over time would learn that no matter what bot we released, eventually that bot would make it into the free ecosystem, and eventually that bot would make it into the premium character crystal. So a lot of the issues we had on previous games where we would release super awesome content and then we would just move on past it because it wasn't going to make us as much money as we wanted, that issue kind of went away in Transformers. And one of the things we found, which is super encouraging, was that these premium character crystals, they continue to sell even a year later. So by actually maintaining this consistency, it's kind of like a promise to our players that these new bots, this new awesome content will eventually make it to a venue where you can get it. We've actually increased our sales on crystals. We've decreased our hoarding of hard currency, which is a serious issue on so many games where you just have players hoarding diamonds or whatever your hard currency is, and you're like, just spend it, guys. And we were actually able to keep that the lowest of all our games. It's pretty much flat. And so it's one of those situations where it's very win-win. So it seems really simple, seems really intuitive, but I would always encourage you that if you're releasing content through LiveOps, that you have some sort of plan on how to get it into the core gameplay. Otherwise, you might realize 6 months later, which feels like, it's nothing to you, but to one of your players is a very long time, and you realize, wow, we really haven't put that really cool bot into the game, and it's been 6 months. All right, so I actually went a bit faster than I anticipated, so I have a little more time for questions.
Thanks. This is really, really helpful information. You mentioned you do reviews of the events. Like, what are kind of the key things you're looking for in regard? Especially you mentioned the shark fin. How you want to avoid that? Is that something you do in the reviews as well?
So the reviews kind of vary by game. On Rival Kingdoms, the player base is very, very hardcore, and so one of the things we always looked at after an event was all of the player feedback. We would collate it, gather, and be like, all right, what are they saying? Of course, we look at all the KPIs like ARPU and ARPU and things like that, but that's actually a little less important to us than what the players think on that game. On Transformers, what we usually look at is engagement and number of battles done. So Transformers is always a bit more of a casual theme, and so we wanted to try and avoid players getting too hardcore playing the game because we were afraid that casual theme plus nostalgia plus really hardcore gameplay would just churn players out. So every week we check that players are not doing more battles during the event per day than we would like them to do. So we kind of look at it on a game-by-game basis. We identify what's important, what are key metrics. Of course, we have all the basic ones: churn, installs, retention, all of that. We look at that, but a lot of those you can't affect really quickly, whereas things like how many battles are they doing is really easy to affect by the design of your event.
I'm Kate Conley. I'm a consultant doing a lot of interesting stuff in games. I'm interested in what are the factors that help you to determine what the drop rate should be in your framework?
So for Transformers, we kind of set a rule that the drop rate was based on the star rating of the bots. And I personally don't like to set drop rates below 1%. That's just my personal opinion, that anything below 1% is cruel and sadistic. So that's where we started. So we said, okay, the rarest thing are 4-star bots. Let's make sure that those are at least 1%. And so we built from there backwards and figured out what a 3-star bot drop rate should be and what a 4-star should be. Of course, now it's not quite exactly that because you have multiple 4 stars and all gets a bit more convoluted. And then we decided that if we released a crystal that focused on a very specific character, that we would only ever increase the odds and not actually make any of the other ones worse. So we kind of went with our personal preference. As Space Ape, we like to be a little nicer to players, but we do all the math. We make sure that there's plenty of room for the game to monetize and have a nice long lifespan. Because if you put that drop percentage too high, you're going to burn out your content really quick. So we actually, at one point, we built a chest simulator. So it was built on JavaScript using multi-threading. So we could simulate someone opening the crystals until they had all the bots. And we did about 10,000 of those runs. And so what we would see is, okay, on average, it would take a player about this many crystal openings to get all of the bots. And we would tweak our numbers until we were happy with that. And that's how we finally came up with our percentage for drop rates.
George Donovan from Goji Games. How do you look at LTV in real time, and do you have someone on the LiveOps team that is part of the UA team that works consistently and looks at data to break out cohorts of LTV rather than just looking at LTV holistically?
So we don't have a UA person per se, but we do have an analytics person per team. So our analytics team kind of sits on their own, but each of them specializes in one of the games. So we have this model for predicting LTV that the analytics team has been working on for a little over 2 years now, and it's really accurate. Every time we think that it might not be working, it estimates it perfectly. So that's our biggest one that we use. We do a lot of estimated LTVs and then validate that as the LTV actually gets there. So we'll say, the estimated 6-month LTV is this, and then when we're actually at 6 months, we compare the two to make sure that we're still on track for our estimations. So our analytics guys are constantly updating us on LTV. If the LTV starts to look like it's going down, it's all in dashboards, so all the UA guys immediately know. And we have weekly meetings where we talk about this kind of thing, where we'll say LTV is going down, so we're going to drop UA a bit. So one of the things that we're really into at Space Ape is to make sure that all of our UA is profitable, which is challenging, but it's obviously how we manage to stay profitable as well. So those two, analytics and UA, are very synced up, especially through dashboards made in Tableau, and that's how they manage it.
Hi, Jim Wagner, Eastside Games. I had a question about the structure of your LiveOps teams. Do you guys use one large centralized team, or do you have kind of sub-teams for each product?
So we use one person per product right now, and we usually double up when we're doing training for someone to leave. So right now, I was on Transformers, and we brought on a new hire, and I trained him up, so we were 2 at the time. And then when I leave Transformers, he'll be in charge. So the main reason we do that is because we're a very small company, so we don't want to have a large LiveOps team, and I'm also really against centralized LiveOps teams because as soon as you put everyone in one little corner and say, hey, you're the centralized LiveOps team, run everything for every game, you just want to kill yourself. It's terrible. So it's like you aren't part of a team. You don't really have any team spirit. You have no say in anything. They're just going to hand over patches and updates to you, and you're expected to monetize it, which hurts your morale, your team's morale, and also hurts the game because it's not going to sync up. So what we do is we embed one LiveOps person. They're part of what we call the product team. So product managers, product owners, LiveOps, and design are all on our product team. We have, depending on how big the team is, various mixtures of those components. And we have a lot of meetings. So the product owner runs the sprints for the main development, but LiveOps sits in on those meetings. So basically every sprint, I can get something I need for LiveOps, or I'll advocate something. I need changes to this tool. I need to have this content by this date, that kind of thing. So we believe that LiveOps should be really involved in the game team because it results in better LiveOps and better content.
Grant Clark from Rakuten Games in Japan. So you've mentioned, you've worked a lot with IPs. Have you ever, or IP holders, for example, do you find it difficult to work with pumping out new LiveOps context? Let's say with the sticky note concept you had. Every time you need to get a LiveOps, or excuse me, an IP holder's approval for something, has it ever blocked your ability to run a schedule? Or
So when I worked for publishing, this happened a lot. When we worked with a lot of companies in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, we used to get kind of like quarterly big dumps. So in between those big dumps was a real struggle because if that dump of content just didn't have enough for that quarter, we would just have to stretch it out. With IP holders, I think it really varies by the company. So at Kabam, they worked with Warner Brothers, and I heard I didn't work on that exact game team, but they had some issues because they were very specifically allowed to use the Hobbit IP, but not Lord of the Rings. And so that was actually very difficult to separate the two because obviously they're very much the same universe. We are working with Hasbro on Transformers, and it's been amazing. Like, Hasbro is an amazing IP partner. They stuck with us quite tightly on development and during the early stages. And then as they saw that we really respected the brand and we built trust and rapport with them, they kind of let us do our own thing. Occasionally, we'll send them approval for like artwork. The avatar I showed you earlier is a Quintesson, and we send that to them. They had it approved in 48 hours, no big deal. But that has come after a lot of relationship building with them. So about a year and a half, we've flown there, they've flown here, but they've been a delight. But it really varies by IP holder.
Hi, Stefan Ramirez, Z2 King. Can you touch on your philosophy or how you leverage A/B testing to validate some of those assumptions, like the Dropbox rates and stuff?
Sure. So we do a lot of A/B tests. Huge fan of A/B tests. Actually, I'm running 2 right now. But for drop rates and monetization, that's really risky. So we try to validate that in alpha and beta. And rather than do A/B tests on that, because that's kind of inherently unfair and feels like you're ripping off someone, we try to do it by changing the chests or the crystals. So if we're doing a gotcha test, we might have, premium gotcha A and premium gotcha B. We'll flavor them up slightly differently and see how they do there. But we won't mess with the variance inside of one of those. And that's more of a moral standpoint of that. Like, I try to be very ethical in how we treat our players with drop rates, because it would be really easy to be really evil and make more money at the same time. But I think that if you want to retain your players and have them move between your games as you make more games, you shouldn't be evil. But we do a lot of other A/B tests. So we'll test things like timers or cooldowns or the cost of things. And usually this is on new players, so it doesn't impact older players as much. And we try to do mostly tests that are positive in gains. So for example, new players might gain a small increase in resources, but it's the kind of increase that wouldn't impact an elder player. But we do test a lot of those kind of aspects. And for A/B testing, we currently use Swerve, but I believe we're building our own in-house solution.
Hey, Chris from 343. Kind of to follow up on what Stefan's question was, when you're doing A/B testing across a large population that's essentially playing the same game with different variables, what does your communication to players look like in that scenario? Like, how are you talking to them? Because we all know players talk to one another,
Sure.
and they know different drop rates and different items. So what does that communication look like?
So because communicating it could totally disinvalidate all your tests, we actually, if we would have to communicate something about a test to the players, then we probably just wouldn't run that test, to be honest. Because at that point, we're saying, hey, we need to tell you about it. Your player behavior is not a valid test. So we would try to filter that before we got to that point and say, hey, would the players notice this change, and is it unfair? So for example, something you might be able to test is a minimum or maximum resource drop rate that isn't published in the game. So for example, if players know that they can get up to this much of a resource doing something, but they don't know the minimum, you could test that minimum without any real repercussions, because they can share it, but it's still going to be very anecdotal. So that's how we try and filter that, is by testing things that are impactful, but aren't necessarily going to disrupt the community too much. The ones that are really disruptful, we try to do during alpha and beta, because at that point we know that if they're in beta, they're usually either such hardcore fans that they're going to stick with us, or we're okay losing them a bit because we didn't really pay for the UA there.
Okay, any burning questions?
Yes, Andrew. I too try not to be evil, but I'm not always successful. You got to get paid. We got to pay all these guys. I'm Jason Bailey, founder of Eastside Games. You talked about the fatigue events that you run. So events that are made to generate engagement and keep everybody going, but aren't really there to monetize. Can you talk a little bit about where that balance is, like how you look at those events in particular?
Sure. So The balance, the first thing to know is that the balance changes over time. So once you have found a cadence, be aware that 6 months from now, that might not be the cadence, because inherently you start with players who enter your game and make a lot of assumptions about your game, but as they participate in your cadence, you are filtering the ones who like your cadence further into your game. So that can create a really hardcore group if your cadence is too intense. For example, on Rival Kingdoms, we had a pretty intense cadence, and our player base now are really hardcore. They're like really into the game, and they always impress us with how dedicated they are. So we adjusted our cadence for Rival Kingdoms to suit that player base. On Transformers, we want them to be more relaxed because we made the assumption that players who like this type of IP and this brand would be into more casual. So our cadence is a bit more relaxed. So the 1 finger events and the 2 finger events, we usually intersperse them between 3 and 4 finger events to try and give breathing space, give them time to recharge. We kind of treat this like the extrovert introvert thing, where some people recharge by being in a group of people, some people recharge by being alone. So we treat it like that. So if we've asked a lot of you, then we give you a break in between. But we definitely experiment with that. And one thing I would also note is that you should mix it up, even if you're really comfortable with your cadence, because there's always learnings to be had. And every now and then we'll throw in something completely random and be like, oh, we're going to go 3-4-3. Why? We want to see what happens. And then we usually we prepare our customer support for that. We say, hey, everything that comes in, take it with a grain of salt. Let us know. If it's really bad, we won't do it again. So we learn that way.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.